Mr. Mortimer Burroughs, president and head undertaker of Burroughs and Clods, was depressed. "Business is just terrible," he moaned, his dark eyes grim. "Why, less than 20 years ago, people were dying to get into my establishment. Now I practically have to go out and recruit." A ghostly, disembodied voice echoed softly from behind his left shoulder. "You think that's bad. What about me?" Mortimer rolled his eyes. "No, I'm not dealing with this now. Not today." Pretending not to hear, he stood up from behind his polished black mahogany desk. "Oh," he groaned, stretching his arms wide. "I've got such a headache. I'm just going to close up shop early and head home." Without looking back, he fished for his conveyor pass with one chubby hand and drew on his suit jacket with the other. "Miss Templar," he called out. "Yes." Her electronic voice halted, followed by 2 odd clicks. "Mr. Burroughs." Miss Templar made her shaky way into the office, navigating her golden-hued metallic body in a zigzag pattern across the room. Morty scowled as she came to a quivering halt and swiveled her glowing yellow eyes in his direction. "Open schedule," he commanded. He pushed back his overstuffed leather chair, tapping his foot in time to her soft clicks and hums. "I'm sorry." "Click, I did not get that," she replied brightly. "Did you say schedule?" He sighed in controlled frustration. "Yes, check schedule," he enunciated, stressing the command words with care. More hums and clicks ensued. "Please clarify," she announced. "Please say 1 for personal schedule or say 2 for business schedule." "Gah, what an infuriating creature," he seethed under his breath. "I'm sorry. Click, click, I did not get that." She replied in a sweet tone. "Please say 1 for personal schedule, or say 2 for business schedule." He shook his head, straightened his tie, and then slipped into his overcoat. He edged his way around her shining bulk and stepped to the door, taking his battered black bowler from the hat tree and tapping it into place upon his round, balding head. Artificial intelligence, bah! More like annoying idiocy. What I wouldn't do for a proper assistant. A breath of cool mist stirred the air next to his ear. "Can I help?" "Hush, no," Mortimer whispered through gritted teeth. "If only my nephew's silly robots worked better." He groaned inwardly. His nephew Melvin Clodes was his partner and a regular genius at programming. But the money they had wasted on this living assistant business had almost exhausted the company's funds. Between the dearth of business and Melvin's malfunctioning toys, the venerable institution of Burroughs was itself near to going under for good. Ignoring the hovering presence at his shoulder, Mortimer shut his eyes and counted to 10. He took a deep breath, raising his chin. 2, he said, his voice tight with annoyance. Click, whir, click. "Thank you, sir," the machine replied. "There is 1 appointment scheduled for this week." Click, that would be click tomorrow morning. Whir, the 31st of October. Click 10 o'clock. Click, click, the last man's funeral. Whir, after that the calendar is completely open. She paused, awaiting new instructions. Mortimer completed fixing his coat. He snapped off the office lights. "Thank you, Miss Templar," he muttered, and he quietly closed the door. Mortimer placed his shoeless feet a bit closer to the fire and sighed in contentment. The walk home from the conveyor station under the late October moon had given him a chill. He placed the remains of his half-eaten Lonely Man microwave dinner on the nearest end table and sat back, cigar in hand. The problem, he philosophized as he stared into the flames, is that burial has become so passé. He took a sip from his depleted tumbler of scotch and soda. Across the room, the ghost seated in his second-best armchair nodded. The motion resembled a wavy sort of bob, but nonetheless his meaning was conveyed. "I know," he moaned. "Not that we really need any more ghosts." Mortimer jerked his gaze away from the flames. "Oh, shut up, Thomas," he snapped, glaring at the spirit. "Must you and all your phantom friends haunt me without end? I don't need you chiming in on my every utterance." The ghost looked down, seeming to fade and curl up into little more than a faintly glowing ball of mist. "Sorry," he wheezed in a drawn-out whispery sigh. Mortimer was instantly contrite. Don't take your frustrations out on others, he thought, chiding himself. He coughed and turned his gaze back to the hearth. "I'm sorry, Tom," he said in a soft tone. "I shouldn't be heaping my upset upon you. It's no one's fault but my own." "And mine," called a cheery voice. A tall young man strode into the study. He was thin and handsome, with bright blue eyes and cheeks rosy from the cold. He nodded toward the softly glowing ovoid. "Hi, Sir Thomas," he exclaimed. "You're looking well this eve." Not waiting for a reply, he made his way to the sideboard, grabbing a Manhattan glass and pouring himself a double shot of the good Scotch on the rocks. "And good evening to you too, Unca," he said over his shoulder. "Can I freshen up your drink?" Mortimer snorted, favoring his back with a sour look. "And what were you up to today, my delinquent nephew?" he groused. "Your infernal Miss Templar nearly drove me to distraction." "Oh, I was gadding about," he drawled. "So sorry you missed me, Unky dear. But I've got to try and sell our little playthings." His eyes twinkled as he threw himself down on the couch in the center of the room. He took a long sip from his drink. A smile stole onto his face. "I've got some good news," he teased, his gaze lighting on both Thomas and his uncle. Profound silence filled the room. Thomas solidified a bit, becoming more man-shaped and less diaphanous. His large gray-blue eyes gazed steadily at Melvin's face. Uncle Mort glowered in his chair, staring down at his empty glass. The grandfather clock ticked the seconds away. Undaunted, Melvin's grin grew even broader. "Well," he exclaimed, "since you are all just dying to know, I'll tell." He paused. "I have got us a contract," he announced in a sing-song voice. He sprang to his feet and took an exaggerated bow, raising his hands to shush the imaginary crowd. "Hold your applause. Please hold your applause. No need to thank me all at once. You are looking at the man who just saved our business. I've just committed us to distributing our living assistant robot servants through the largest corporation on Earth." "Who's that, you might ask?" "Well, only Consolidated Afterlife Incorporated, that's who." He nearly danced with glee. Mortimer's eyebrows shot up and his hands clenched in rage. "Consolidated! Why, those cheating SOBs are the reason my business is going under." He raised his gaze and glared at his fool of a nephew. "You talked to them," he hissed. "You went to meet with Jacobus Finkelstern, behind my back." "Now, Unky," Melvin wheedled, "I know you and old Mr. Jake have been at odds in the past, but when I showed him our books and explained to him how desperate we were—" "You what?" Mortimer screamed. "You showed that old pirate our financials?" Mort's eyes were popping out of his head. Jacobus Blackjack Finkelstern was the worst corporate bone-picker on the planet. Why, if he got his meat hooks into Burroughs' business, they'd be out on the street before he could say poltergeist. Bellowing with rage, Morty sprung from his armchair, intending to throttle his poor dead sister's half-witted son. "Gentlemen, please." Thomas's voice was like a blast of howling wind. The ghost materialized in front of him, assuming human form from the waist up, arms outstretched, shielding Melvin from his uncle's wrath. "Sit down, please, both of you, and let's discuss this situation like gentlemen." Thomas's form became solid, his cold hands pressing on Mort's chest. Mort pulled up short, glaring at the spook, shaking his head. "Didn't you hear what that cloud-cuckoo nephew of mine just said?" he screeched. "Why, he's sold us down the river to Black Jack." Mort seemed to deflate, sinking back into his armchair with a heavy sigh. "Oh, what's the use?" he exclaimed in despair. "We're ruined anyway. Black Jack and his damnable body reclamation have dug up every other graveyard on the planet. Why not just give in and let him have ours too?" "Now, Morty," Thomas implored. "You don't mean that." His eyes swiveled to rest briefly on Melvin's face. Melvin is only trying to help. Melvin was a bit crestfallen. Yes, Uncle Mort, he said. I was only trying anything I could think of to help save our family business. He reseated himself on the edge of the couch, fixing his gaze on his uncle's morose features. Mom always told me that family was the most important thing. I'd never do anything to harm you, Uncle. He was overcome with guilt, his eyes sweeping the floor. Mortimer gazed at him, his lips pressed in a grim line. The boy meant no harm, my old friend. Don't be upset, Thomas continued softly. He paused, looking back towards the bright flames. Perhaps this is even a good thing. His eyes narrowed. You know you need the money. Why not take it from the old blackguard himself? He began to pace in front of the fire, his legs moving back and forth through the coffee table, unheeded in his distraction. Mort and Melvin watched him silently. Don't get me wrong. I fully agree with your opinion of that dastardly man. Jacobus Finkelstern is the most despised person in the spirit world. His eyes glinted in the firelight. Both of you know what his company has done to us spooks, why there is almost no place left on earth for a wandering ghost to call home. Both men looked down, embarrassed. It was true. Over the last 20 years, the people of Earth had just about run out of room for the living. As a consequence, they found they could no longer afford to waste buildable land to hallow the dead. Jacobus Finkelstern and Consolidated Afterlife had hit the trend just right. Their new process of body reclamation had transformed the whole business of dying. Their method eliminated the inconvenience and expense of traditional interment and was more appealing than cremation. Supercomputers scanned and reproduced every detail of the dearly departed. Given a small fragment of bone or a few traces of mummified flesh, even those long gone could be restored. Then, for just a small monthly fee, the essence of your dearly departed was forever preserved within Consolidated's massive servers. You could visit their place of eternal rest any time, from the convenience of your own home. In short order, the procedure became wildly popular. Around the globe, funeral homes began to shut for lack of customers. In less than 2 decades, Consolidated had managed to buy up and close nearly every graveyard on Earth. This had had a strange side effect. As burial grounds were emptied and transformed into construction sites, ghosts, once elusive and shy, started to appear everywhere. The neglected graves of the world had been their last refuge in a modern and secular society. These spirits found themselves forced into a great migration, herded, as it were, into ever smaller patches of hauntable real estate. In the last few months, the situation had become grim. Graveyards were emptied as fast as they could be purchased. Mortimer shook his head, his eyes fixed upon the threadbare carpet. As far as he knew, the cemetery owned by his family might be the last suite of grave plots on this continent, possibly the world. Mortimer looked up. Thomas was still pacing. His face bore an expression of intense concentration. I'm so sorry, Thomas, he muttered. I know what this means for you and your fellow shades. Thomas stopped, facing the blaze, but said nothing. Melvin looked at them. Hey, what's the big deal? He called out with forced cheer. I mean, even if we lose the last graveyard, Sir Thomas is always welcome to stay with us. He paused as both of his companions turned to stare at him. Well, can't he, Uncle? Mortimer shook his head. You tell him, Tom, he said, making his way to the sideboard to replenish his drink. Melvin focused his gaze on Thomas. The ghost turned and said nothing for a moment. Then he sighed. Melvin, he asked, do you know how a person becomes a ghost? Without waiting for a reply, he plowed on. There are 3 essential criteria. He held up a translucent hand, ticking off each finger. First, the obvious, you must be dead. Melvin nodded. Duh, he thought, but he held his tongue. Second, the spirit continued, his voice growing soft. You must have some unfinished business, something that keeps you from crossing over. Thomas looked down. An expression of deep pain crossed his face. He paused for a long moment, and then raised his gaze, staring off into a shadowed corner of the study. Last and most important, he intoned. There must be an anchor, something physical that binds the person's spirit to this world. He sighed. This is the root of our crisis. Ghosts need graveyards. Without them, we are doomed. He fell silent. The clock ticked softly. A profound silence fell upon the men. Melvin shook his head, and then he forced a smile. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, he said brightly. I mean, we will miss you, Thomas, but can't you and all the rest of the spirits just, cross over? Thomas stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away and strode into the shadows, dissipating without a sound. Melvin's mouth hung open. He looked over at his uncle and raised his eyebrows. I didn't mean to say anything wrong, he began. Mortimer cut him off. Melvin, he seethed. For a bright guy, sometimes you say the stupidest things. He shook his head slowly. Weren't you listening to anything Thomas explained? He sat down on the couch next to his nephew and half turned to stare into his eyes. Let me ask you, why do you think the Burroughs graveyard is so chock full of spirits, ghosts, shades, hobgoblins, and every other form of ectoplasmic manifestation that it practically glows? Without waiting for a reply, he continued, It's the last bit of hallowed ground left, you nitwit. Destroy that anchor point, and every spirit in the place will become homeless. Homeless spirits can't remain on Earth. Worse yet, their unfinished business means they can't cross over. So they just fade into nothingness. Melvin's face grew pale. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I'd no idea. Poor Thomas. Mortimer nodded. So listen here, sonny boy. If you want to help, you just better make sure that your little mechanical toys meet old Black Jack's approval. If we lose this business, every ghost on Earth is doomed. The speaker on the desk emitted a soft bleep. Mr. Click Burroughs, there is someone here to see you. Mortimer looked up from his terminal and glanced at his watch. It's almost 10 o'clock. Probably some people from the Lastman party have arrived. He rubbed his eyes. His head was still aching. Last night, after Melvin had gone to sleep, he and Thomas had stayed up into the wee hours. They'd been joined by hundreds of other spirits, representatives of the thousands, if not millions, whose existence now depended on his family's grave plots. All of them were worried about their future. Between the lack of sleep and the dent he'd put in the Scotch decanter, he was hardly at his best. I just hope some of what we talked about last night worked its way into the head of that fool nephew of mine. Reaching across the desk, he pressed the button on the comm unit. Please show them in, Miss Templar. Mortimer sat up straighter. He steepled his hands together upon the desk and composed himself. Always place yourself at the service of the customer. His late father had taught him this so many years ago. He looked up as the door to his office swung open. His expression went from calm and sympathetic to shocked in an instant. You, he squeaked. Who the devil let you in here? How's a boy, Morty? The surprise guest rumbled in a gravelly Brooklyn baritone. Nah, stay where yous are. Don't get up. The apparition waddled across the room, his sharp black eyes boring into Morty's. Nice office, he remarked. I think I'll keep the desk. But this crappy carpet and them chairs just gotta go. The immense man removed his hat and tossed it down on Mortimer's desk, as though he owned the place. Without being asked, he drew up a chair and sat down with a heavy sigh. He twisted his thick lips into a feral snarl. Mind if I light up? He asked. Not waiting for a reply, he bit the end off of a fat black stogie and puffed it into flame. He leaned back, casually placing his booted feet up on the leather seat cushion of the chair next to his, and blew a cloud of foul-smelling smoke into the air. "Wha's a matter, Morty, old son?" he exclaimed with a wicked laugh. "Cat got your tongue?" Well, Mortimer sneered, "if it isn't Black Jack Finkelstern." Jack flashed an evil grin. "In the flesh. Why don't you just sit yourself down and get comfortable?" Mort replied with heavy sarcasm. "I understand you've recently signed a contract with my nephew. I warned him to make sure your check cleared before he delivered." Jack took his feet off of the cushion and sat up. "That'll be about enough out of you, Burrows," he growled. "You and your fool of a nephew are mine now." He reached into his jacket and drew out a folded paper. "I don't suppose the little cherub shared all the details of our agreement, so just to make sure yous appreciates who's in charge here, I figured I'd drop a copy on yous myself." He tossed the document onto Mort's desk. Mortimer looked at it with disgust. He cleared his throat. "Ahem. I'm accustomed to my guests behaving with a bit more decorum." He sniffed. "Coming from the likes of riffraff like you, however, I expected no less. Now hear this, you old pirate. My nephew and I fully intend to meet the terms of your contract as long as payment is made for services rendered. I'm well aware of your cheating, lying ways, Jacobus." Jack's dark eyes burned. He bared his teeth and leaned forward, his hooked nose almost touching Mort's face. "Just you wait," he growled. "I want to see a demo tomorrow. I'll be here at 9 a.m. sharp. You follow?" He leaned back and laughed softly. "From the looks of ol' Ms. Templar out there," he sneered, "I'll 'spect you to be out of these offices by the end of the day." He stood up, grabbing his hat and puffing another lungful of foul fumes into the air. He tossed the butt into the potted plant on Mort's coffee table. "So long for now, Mortimer," he drawled. "Oh, and by the way, your last man booking won't be making a show." He chortled with glee. "That was me. I got him to cancel at the last minute. I offered him 100% free reclamation, as long as they canceled on you today." He turned and tipped his hat. "Looking forward to tomorrow, Morty." He flung open the door, pushing past Miss Templar with a laugh. "This is just terrible." Mortimer tossed the signed and sealed contract across the desk. "How could you?" he groaned, glaring at the top of Melvin's curly blonde head. Melvin raised his head and looked up at him sheepishly. "Don't worry, Unky. We're not going to fail." He glanced down at his signature. "I know it seems crazy, but it was the only way I could get Mr. Jacobus to make that large of a purchase commitment." Mortimer glared at him, the color rising into his wattled cheeks. "The whole company?" he bellowed. "You placed your stake in the whole company at risk for a purchase commitment?" He raised his eyes to the ceiling. "Oh, Hortense, how could you have raised such a meshugana of a son?" He lowered his gaze to Melvin, who cringed a bit further down into his chair. "Melvin," he thundered, "this contract gives Blackjack Finkelstern the right to close us down if he's not 100% satisfied with your demonstration. How could you sign such a thing?" He buried his face in his hands. Melvin sat silent. The contract stirred, seemingly of its own accord, and then opened up fully upon the leather desk blotter. "You know, this agreement cuts both ways." Thomas's head popped into view, sporting an accountant's green eyeshade and magnifying spectacles. He held the contract up to the light, examining it closely. "According to this, Jacobus has committed consolidated afterlife to both purchase and resell at least 10,000 units of our living assistant robots." He looked up from the page and gazed at the two men. "Why, this contract is worth millions, and it's all perfectly legal." "Let me see that." Mortimer snatched the document from the ghost's hands. "Yes. Well, okay. He muttered. Melvin and Thomas exchanged glances. A smile stole over Mortimer's chubby cheeks. "By Hermes, you are right." His eyes danced with glee. "My boy, if you can just get your clunkers to work, we can beat the old devil with his own money." The glow in Mort's eyes faded. "But I was forgetting. It's no use. If Miss Templar is any example of what we have to show, then there is no way we will win this business." He placed his head in his hands once more. "The deadline is tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp," he groaned. "We just don't have enough time." "It is an auspicious night, don't you think?" Startled, Melvin glanced back at Sir Thomas. He'd almost forgotten he was there. He and the spirit had spent all afternoon working to improve Miss Templar, but for the last hour or two, Thomas had hardly spoken to him. He'd seemed to be preoccupied and troubled. Sorry, what? I mean, why is this night different from any other night? Thomas's form became solid. Without making a sound, he stepped up behind the younger man, placing one bloodless hand on Melvin's shoulder. With the other, he gestured out over the shadowy, mist-covered graveyard before them. Tonight is All Hallows' Eve, he whispered. Halloween. Melvin's eyes widened as his gaze followed the ghost's hand. Distant howling and disembodied clunking noises floated towards them on the chill breeze. This night, the doors to the spirit world open wide. Thomas's expression grew stern. His eyes glinted with a cold light, reflecting the rising full moon. Tonight, the phantoms that haunt this world rise up from this last plot of hallowed ground. They assume form and substance and walk amongst the living. It is an auspicious night. Melvin nodded, saying nothing. The box of equipment he'd been carrying was heavy, and the night air was making him wheeze. He bent and placed his load beside the pile of fresh earth at his feet. Thomas's soft voice whispered in his ear, "They are desperate, you know." A shiver ran down Melvin's spine. He swallowed. His mouth was suddenly dry. "Well, Sir Thomas," he croaked, "here's hoping that your idea works, or this may be their last Halloween ever." Thomas nodded. "It is time." His eyes blazed as his hands flowed forward, icy fingers tightening around his companion's neck. Mortimer was beside himself. Melvin and Sir Thomas had been working on Miss Templar through the night, and he could hardly wait to see what they'd come up with. He was so nervous, he found sleep impossible. Giving up the struggle, he'd risen at first light and trekked his way to the office. "I suppose they've hidden Miss Templar somewhere," he reasoned, noting her absence when he'd arrived to open up. While he waited, he busied himself with preparations, setting out chairs and brewing a pot of coffee. He glanced at his watch for the 7th time. Where the devil can they be? It was almost 9, nearly time for Black Jack to show up, and neither Melvin nor Sir Thomas had made an appearance. For that matter, the whole house and the grounds seemed practically deserted. Most mornings he could count on both hands the number of sprites, spooks, or other heebie-jeebies he would have run into by now. The eerie absence of otherworldly presences was unnerving. Suddenly the exterior door opened, and he heard the familiar clicks and whirs coming from the anteroom. "They're here at last." Mortimer cleared his throat. "Melvin, Miss Templar." "Is that you, Miss Templar?" he called. "Can you come in here, please?" He craned his neck, trying to see if the infernal rattle-trap had heard him. His office door flew open with a bang. Startled, he looked up to see the grinning bulk of Jacobus Finkelstern looming in the entryway like an ominous black cloud. "I sees use is keepin' my chair warm dis mornin', Morty," he mocked. He strode into the room. "Well, where's the demo? Come on, Mort. Chop, chop." Mortimer did not move. "Good morning, Jacobus," he replied in a calm tone. "Have a seat. My nephew should be here shortly. In the meantime, can I have Miss Templar get you anything?" Jack looked at him, nonplussed. "Sure," he laughed. "Why not? Hey, Miss Goldie Toes, give me some coffee." Mortimer cringed as Miss Templar jittered her way into the doorframe. "Good click morning, gentlemen," she said brightly. I Clickwer did not understand your request. Her eyes swiveled across both men. "Can you please clarify? Please say 1 for click coffee, click, 2 for click tea, or 3 for click juice." "Hoo boy," Jacobus hooted. "Ya gotta be kiddin' me, Morty, old pal." He laughed out loud. "Dis hunk of junk is what you gonna demo." He placed his hands on his wide hips and beamed with evil pleasure. Mortimer's face fell. "Thank you, Miss Templar," he said quietly. "We will help ourselves." Miss Templar whirred and buzzed, turning her head in his direction. Mortimer waited, his face assuming a beet-red hue. "Cancel, Miss Templar," he enunciated over Black Jack's sniggers. Mercifully, she turned and worked her way back to her station. Mortimer looked down at his desk blotter, chagrined. We're doomed. Before he could say another word, the office door burst open once more, and Melvin ran in. He was a mess. His clothes were covered in streaks of mud, and his hair stuck out in all directions. Mortimer's mouth dropped open in shock. Melvin skidded to a stop between the two older men, wild-eyed. "Oh, Unky, I am late. I'm so sorry," he gabbled in a breathless rush. "Sir Thomas and I spent all yesterday trying to get Miss Templar to work properly, but we just could not figure out a way. Then Sir Thomas had a brilliant idea. But to make it work, he needed to understand everything about how I constructed Miss Templar." He stopped and looked around, suddenly aware that Blackjack was in the room and listening intently. He shook his head as if to clear out the cobwebs. Then he continued in a less excited tone. "I'm not sure if he learned everything he needed. All I know is, when I woke up this morning, I found myself lying on the cold ground in the middle of the Burrows graveyard. Next to me there was a pile of dirt and a giant open pit." Melvin's voice lowered to a hoarse whisper. "And do you know what the strangest thing was?" Mortimer shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. "I was alone," Melvin intoned. "Not a spook or a spirit or even a pixie was left." His blue eyes widened. "They're all gone, Unky, even Sir Thomas." "Well, I'll be," Jacobus laughed. "Dad sure is one crazy story you got there, kid." His black brows beetled in anger. "But listen here, Sonny. I ain't got all day." He stood and made as if he were going to storm out. "If yous can't start dis here demo in the next 10 seconds, the deal is off," he roared. "And I'll 'spect yous to be handing me the keys to dis dump on my ways out, too." Melvin jumped. "Why, of course, Mr. Jacobus," he exclaimed. "I'm so sorry to have inconvenienced you." Something in the anteroom caught his eye. He stared past the obese man, his eyes widening in surprise. That is, we'll be ready to start the demo in 5 minutes." He slipped out of his soiled jacket and bent down to strike some of the clods from his muddy trousers. "I will be with you in a moment, gentlemen." He continued with confidence. "I will just go and fetch Miss Templar and meet you both in the large conference room." He glanced at his uncle. "Is that all right, Unky?" he asked, with an imploring look at Mortimer. "I just need a couple of minutes to do a small software upgrade. Be right back." With that, he strode out of the room. The two men listened as he and Miss Templar clicked and whirred their way into the small storeroom behind her desk. Mortimer cleared his throat. "I've no idea what's going on, but I'm going to play this out as Melvin requests." He lowered his brows into a grave expression. "If you would just follow me, please," he said, glancing at Jacobus. Setting his jaw, Mort got up and made his way down the hall to the conference room. Blackjack's mouth hung open. "Why, I don't believe it," he bellowed. His face contracted into a scowl. "Is this some sort of trick, Burrows?" Mortimer was doing his best to contain his own surprise. The office helper demo Melvin had just finished presenting was almost too good for him to believe either. Miss Templar had been wonderful, far superior to even the best human assistant. For a moment his lips burned with the desire to hurl questions at his beaming nephew, but he recalled the part he was to play. Mortimer turned to face Jacobus. "No tricks, you old pirate," he said calmly. "This is our latest top-of-the-line living assistant, Miss Templar. 2.0. Melvin nodded with excitement. "That's right," he agreed with a grin. He glanced over at Miss Templar. The robot was listening attentively. As soon as he caught her eye, he made a subtle gesture. "Yes, Mr. Claude," she announced. "I'm very pleased to be of service, sir." She looked at the men in turn. "It is my humble pleasure to fulfill my prime function." As she spoke, she moved gracefully around the room, avoiding the scattered chairs. She reached the sideboard, extended 2 manipulators, and raised the tray of ceramic coffee cups. "Now, I know Mr. Burrows prefers his coffee with 3 sugars, and Mr. Claude's would like herbal tea. What may I get for you, Mr. Finkelstern?" she inquired, subtly stressing the first syllable of their guest's surname. Jacobus just glared, grinding his teeth. "Keep your cruddy coffee," he yelled. "I ain't thirsty." Now, Jacobus, mind your manners," Mort chided him in a sweet tone. "I assume from your reaction that there will be no argument. Our robot demonstration is a complete success. When can we expect you to send your first check?" Blackjack's face darkened, assuming a shade of magenta that his cardiologist would find alarming. "Why, you little so-and-so," he bellowed. "You's gotta be cheatin'." He jumped up from his chair. "Dat rusty collection of screws and springs can't work. Why, I had my best men make sure." He trailed off, realizing that all eyes were upon him. Mortimer cleared his throat. "Make sure of what, Jack?" he asked. "That Miss Templar would fail?" "You call me a cheat, but it's you who's been cheating all along." Jack's mouth worked, but he could not form a reply. The color in his cheeks went from magenta to a sickly shade of puce. "I won't send yez a dime, Burroughs," he screamed. Jack reached across the table and snatched up the contract, tearing it in two. "This deal is off." Grabbing his water glass, he drew his arm back, intending to hurl it at Mortimer. In an instant, his wrist was encircled by an immovable cuff of steel. He squeaked as Miss Templar placed his tumbler back on the table, and then extended two heavy-duty lifters, picking his bulky body up into the air. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a musical lilt. "Let me get your hat and show you to the door." With that, she wheeled Jack down the hall, making sure to place his hat neatly upon his greasy black head. "Thank you, sir," she called. The outer door swung open, followed by a bone-crunching crash, and then a groan. The door closed with a gentle click. "Have a pleasant day." Melvin winced as the muffled groaning continued outside. "Ah, Unky," he began. "Melvin!" the older man shouted. Melvin looked at the floor, chagrined. "Yes, Unky. That was, beyond doubt, the most outrageous business meeting I have ever attended." Melvin continued to stare at the carpet. "And it was spectacular." Melvin looked up in shock. Uncle Mortimer was beaming at him. "Melvin, my boy, I can't remember the last time I felt this good." As he spoke, Miss Templar joined them, gliding in from the hall, placing herself next to the sideboard once more. "And here is the fantastic creation," Mort chortled with glee. "Miss Templar," he called. "Yes, sir," she answered. "Did I do well, sir?" "Well." His eyes popped open. "You were incredible. Unbelievable." Mortimer turned and pierced his nephew with a sharp glance. "Too good." "Melvin, what exactly did you and Sir Thomas do to this former rattletrap?" He glanced at Miss Templar. "No offense, my dear." "None taken, sir," she replied. Melvin blushed to the roots of his hair. "Well, it was Sir Thomas's idea," he replied, grinding a toe into the carpet. "All right, then," Mort exclaimed. "I've been wondering all morning. Where, in all the 9 pits of Hades, is Sir Thomas?" "I'm right here." The ghostly voice seemed to emanate from the underside of the table. Mort ducked down to look. "Where?" he called. "Thomas, show yourself." "I'm not under the table. I'm here." Mort looked up. There, emblazoned upon Miss Templar's golden breastplate, was Thomas's familiar face. Mortimer was taken aback. "Thomas," he gasped, "was all this done by you?" He suddenly felt woozy. The stress of the meeting and the lack of sleep was catching up with him. "Unky," Melvin cried, "you don't look so well. Sit down. Have a glass of water or some coffee." Mortimer sat down heavily. "So," he groaned, "it was too good to be true. You had me fooled, boys." He took a sip of water with a shaky hand. "I thought you'd worked some sort of software miracle, but it was just Sir Thomas all along." He sighed. "I suppose we are still ruined." Melvin and Sir Thomas exchanged looks. "Do you want to tell him?" Melvin said out of the side of his mouth. "Or should I?" Sir Thomas winked at him, his eyes now backlit by Miss Templar's golden carapace. "It's all yours, my boy," he intoned. "Go for it." Mortimer looked up. "Oh, bother," he complained. "What are you two whispering about? Can't you see I'm in despair over here?" Melvin cleared his throat. "Unky," he croaked. It's not what you think." Mort gazed at him in silence. "You see, we didn't fake anything." His voice grew stronger and more confident. "Last night Sir Thomas and I were close to despairing too. Then he had a crazy idea." Melvin looked at the ghost, who nodded encouragingly. "You see, we really had two problems. Or that is, both of us, or rather all of us had problems." Mortimer glared at him. "Geez, I've got such a headache. Please, just get to the point." Okay, Unc." Melvin swallowed hard. The words came tumbling out in a rush. "Here's the deal. Sir Thomas is haunting Miss Templar." Mortimer looked at him nonplussed. "What, in Anne's Green Gables, does that mean?" "Okay, well, you know that all of the graveyards in the world except for ours were dug up and ruined by old Mr. Jake." Mort nodded. "So all of the ghosts were going to be homeless, and they would be destroyed if they could not cross over." Yes, go on." "So Sir Thomas had a crazy plan. He thought, we can solve the problem of making truly lifelike robots and the problem of homeless ghosts at the same time. We just have to get the ghosts into the machines." Mort stared at him goggle-eyed. Melvin hurried on. "It was a brilliant idea. But at first, when Sir Thomas tried to animate Miss Templar, he could not control her. In desperation, we went out to the old graveyard to see if we could somehow find a way to combine the ghost anchor of the hallowed ground and my robot circuitry. Long story short, to acquire my electronic expertise, Sir Thomas flowed his spirit into my body. I fainted. When I came to and ran into the office this morning, I thought he had failed. Then I saw Miss Templar in the anteroom, with Sir Thomas's face on her chest plate." Mort just stared at him. "Don't you see, Unky, it worked, and we solved everybody's problems." "Yes," Thomas breathed. "Think of it, Mortimer. We can make thousands of robots, as many as you want, and everyone will have a resting spot, a permanent home for a homeless ghost." Wait a minute." Mortimer stood up. Hands splayed flat on the table, eyes popped open, and his jowls quivering. Mottled red spots bloomed on his cheeks. Thomas and Melvin stared at him. Even Miss Templar seemed frozen into immobility. "You mean to tell me that you two idiots have invented a way to unleash hordes of haunted robots upon the earth?" Melvin swallowed hard. His face was pale and waxen. He nodded. "Yes, Unky," he replied in a whisper. "We have." Mortimer gazed skyward, his lips forming unheard words. He lowered his gaze, fixing his eyes upon them. A beatific smile spread across his face. "How wonderful,"